Evening all. There's a few other tips and tricks and important things to consider when creating sections, so we're going to go over those really quick and then I'll film a little section demo in Procreate. The first thing is establishing dominance of the cut line. Historically, I've done a pretty poor job at listening to this advice, and I feel like I owe it to Stephanie to emphasize it and make sure that you've heard it loud and clear. So always make sure, whether you're illustrating by hand or in the Creative Suite, that the cut line has the heaviest line weight. These are, exaggerations for sure. They don't need to be this thick, but I think they do a pretty good job at getting the point across. The second thing is to avoid the bounding of the ground materials into a box. Instead, you can leave the material blank or let it fade out around the edges. The ground doesn't stop just because you say it does, and it really doesn't make sense to contain it. And I'm fairly guilty of doing this in my own practice, and I'm working on breaking that habit, and I want to make sure that you don't get into it as well. Another really helpful addition to a section graphic is a key plan, essentially indicating where your section is cut relative to the whole site, or at a minimum within the area that you're working on. For Angelica, my group partner last year, this was the pavilion she designed and the detailed plan to go with it, and these accompaniments just allow the reader to distinguish where it is they're looking at fairly quickly. So when it comes to determining scale for a Procreate illustration, there's a few ways to do that. The first is exporting basic line work with the scale bar into Illustrator from Rhino and then saving that file to later open up in Procreate. To do this, I just cut the 1 to 50 section that I showed you in the last tutorial down to an appropriate size by trimming it to a bounding box, because I knew that would be better suited to a 1 to 20 detail scale. So Google Maps is another fairly obvious way to grab a scaled reference image, either by taking a screenshot that has an appropriately sized scale bar or by using the measure distance tool for a little more accuracy. So you can just zoom into your site there and either take a screenshot, making sure that your scale bar is small enough, or you can right click and use the measure distance tool. It'll direct you how to sort of operate here, but you would essentially just click to set one side, click to set the other side, and then you can measure it accordingly and take a screenshot that has both the distance of the section itself and the scale bar, in the corner. Google Earth has a fairly similar, albeit better function. So locating your site again and maintaining an accurate plan view by using the View, Reset, Tilt, and Compass. You have a few options. First, by saving an image directly by clicking the location icon up at the top, and you can ensure that it has a scale bar and a north arrow just by selecting them. And then you can go ahead and save the image, and you can set your whatever graphic resolution you're interested in. Google Earth also has a measure tool, but it's a little bit better than Google Maps because it has an elevation profile option. So you can go ahead and select the ruler up the top there, which will give you the measure function. And if you're on path instead of line, then you have the ability to show your elevation profile. And then you can just select the beginning and the end of your section by clicking 2 points and making sure you're at the length that you want. And then once you've sort of set it, it gives you this elevation profile at the bottom there that is rough, and it's a fair estimate, but all in all, I'd say it's pretty accurate. And then you can either take a screenshot or use the scale bar or simply trace this elevation line, which will all give you the correct sort of length for your section line that you're looking for. The only thing is you have to take a screenshot of this because there's not an option to save it, so just keep that in mind. When you bring a screenshot into Procreate, you can orient your section line to the horizontal plane and then trace it over. When I do this, I include transition markers like road to the right of way, to the sidewalk, trees, or any other information that might be relevant to drawing the section. And then I'll navigate to the Canvas menu and select Drawing Guide on Procreate. The Drawing Guide will set up a grid for you that can sort of act as a great scaling tool. So when you select Edit, Drawing Guide, it will bring you here. And then under the grid size option, you can sort of fiddle with the size of the squares to match up with your section line. So this is about 20 meters, and I want each box to represent a single meter. So I scaled the grid to match the image and then trace a scale bar over it. So this way you can ensure that your drawing is scaled and that you have a reference grid that is accurate when you're populating the graphic with site objects like people and trees. The workflow for Google Earth is fairly similar. You can bring in the image and trace the line accordingly with relative ease. You can also bring in the elevation profile and trace it that way for a little bit more accuracy. But of course, that's assuming that the original elevation is what you actually want to represent as opposed to a site intervention that you're proposing. And then you can navigate to the drawing guide function again, scale your grid appropriately, and then trace your scale bar. For the purpose of the tutorial and just the general sake of ease and accuracy, I'm going to use the existing line work that I brought in from Rhino to Illustrator and bring it into Procreate by inserting a file under the Actions menu and navigating to my OneDrive. So we get a free terabyte of storage with UBC, so if you haven't set that up yet, you should definitely consider it. And then once I have the file in, I can begin tracing. So I typically start with the section line, which is going to be the thickest line on the drawing, as we've already discussed, and then I'll move on to the scale bar. And then I finish up the rest of the line work with just a lighter weight pen. For the record, it doesn't really matter what brush or pen you use. That part for me is always sort of a mix of personal preference and project dependence. For this, I'm just using a technical pen under inking. And then when I'm happy with my line work, I can move on to the details. For me, this section is about illustrating rainwater management tactics, so I started with the bioswale. And I could have easily popped in a tree and a shrub and, call it a bioswale, but like I mentioned yesterday, at 1 to 20 scale, detail is critical. So instead, I can actually illustrate specific types of planting. And with this drawing, I've begun with the sedges or water-friendly grasses, and then I moved on to plants of seasonal interest and pollinator-friendly species, and then just any other species that would indicate the general presence of a bioswale. Then I can move on to populating a few trees, and while I'm not explicit on the exact species with this drawing, it does have some nice detail to it, and I'll be able to label that shortly. And then I added a low opacity tree in the background just to give a little bit of depth to the section, and then turned on my drawing guide again to ensure that the figures I add to the drawing are to scale. So since we know that 1 square is equal to a single meter, and the average height of a person is, somewhere in between 1.6 to 1.8 meters, I know exactly how to size them. Then I can start bringing in color to represent materials and material changes by just using the color dropper method. So I can hold my pen on the color I select in the top corner and then drag it onto the shape I want to fill. But of course, this can only happen when elements are closed shapes, so try to remember that when you're working on your drawing. And to bring some life to the planting and planted areas, I just added some more color, and I did that by playing around with the different types of painted brushes and textures. Again, there's no real rhyme or reason as to why I chose to do the things that I did, but I just test out a few things and settle on something I like. Finally, I was able to add a super faded background at maybe like 5 or 6%, just from an old drawing that I actually had for this specific project. And then I went ahead and labeled all of the major elements. And although I recommend you do this with, architectural text and some proper alignment and a grid and just a little bit more finesse, I just want you to sort of understand that section labels can be very useful.